The nursery alarm shrieked through the royal quarters at 030 hours, its piercing wail cutting through the silence like a blade. Queen Zarathek bolted upright, her 6 arms reaching for weapons that weren't there, her compound eyes adjusting instantly to the darkness. Empty. Every sleeping pod in the royal nursery stood open, their biolocks disengaged, her 3 cubs nowhere to be found. Captain Vex materialized beside her before she could speak, his exoskeleton gleaming dully in the emergency lighting. "My queen, the perimeter is secure. No breaches detected." "Then where are my children?" Her voice carried the deadly calm that had once reduced enemy fleets to ash. The nursery's AI flickered online, projecting security feeds across crystalline displays. "Scanning," the synthetic voice announced. "Royal offspring detected. Level 7. Maintenance sector." Zarathek's blood chilled. Level 7 housed the waste processing units, atmospheric recyclers, and the quarters of the lowest servant castes. What could possibly draw her cubs to such a place? She moved through the corridor like liquid shadow, Vex matching her stride perfectly. The maintenance sector reeked of industrial cleansers and recycled air, its walls bare metal instead of the polished bioceramic of the upper levels. Tracking sensors led them deeper, past humming machinery and sleeping quarters smaller than her private bathroom. The readings grew stronger. They rounded a corner and froze. Through the open doorway of a cramped janitor's quarters, they could see him, the human maintenance worker who'd been assigned to their ship 3 cycles ago. He sat cross-legged on his narrow bunk, perfectly still, while all 3 of her cubs curled against his body like they were sleeping in their mother's embrace. Tech Lee, her youngest, had wrapped his small arms around the human's waist, Morden pressed against his left side, tiny claws gripping the fabric of the man's uniform. Syra, her eldest at barely 4 cycles, rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing slow and peaceful. The human's eyes met Zarathek's across the room. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't dare disturb the sleeping children. His face showed no fear, only resignation and something that might have been protectiveness. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The human, she remembered his name now, David Chen, mouthed words without sound. "They came to me." Captain Vex stepped forward, hand moving to his weapon. "My queen, I can extract them without—" "No." The word cut through the air like a command to the universe itself. She studied the scene before her, her mind racing through possibilities. Her cubs had never shown such attachment to anyone outside the family. They barely tolerated their tutors, fled from diplomats, and treated servants as living furniture. Yet here they were, sleeping more peacefully than she'd seen in weeks. Tech Lee stirred slightly, making a soft humming sound that Zarathek recognized as pure contentment. The human's hand moved instinctively to stroke the child's carapace, the gesture so natural it might have been carved into his DNA. "The nursery reported them missing 4 hours ago," Vex murmured. "The locks should have contained them." Zarathek stepped closer, her movements careful and silent. The human tracked her approach but remained motionless, a living statue cradling her children. She could smell their scent on him, not just from tonight, but older traces, as if this wasn't the first time. "How long?" she asked, her voice pitched barely above a whisper. David's throat worked silently before he found his voice. 2 weeks, he breathed. "They started coming during 3rd shift. I tried to bring them back, but they always returned." The admission hung in the air like an unexploded weapon. 2 weeks of protocol violations, of unauthorized contact with the royal family, of secrets that could mean his death. Yet looking at her children, Zarathek felt something crack inside her chest. Not anger, but recognition. They looked safe. More than safe, they looked happy. Syra's eyes fluttered open, meeting her mother's gaze without alarm. "Mama," she whispered, snuggling deeper into the human's embrace. "David tells good stories." The words struck Zarathek like physical blows. When had her daughter ever looked so at peace? When had any of them sought comfort from anyone but her? She thought of the sterile nursery, the endless protocols, the careful distance maintained between her cubs and the rest of the universe. What stories, she found herself asking. "About Earth," Syra murmured sleepily. "About families who stay together. About homes with gardens where little ones can run free." Each word was a knife to Zarathek's heart. She looked at the human janitor holding her children and saw something she'd forgotten existed. Simple kindness without agenda, care without calculation. In his eyes, she didn't see the queen of the hegemony. She saw a mother whose children had found something they needed, something they weren't getting from her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither dared voice. Finally, David spoke again, his words careful and measured. "Your Majesty, they're remarkable children. They just needed," he trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence that would condemn them all. "They needed what?" Zarathek asked, though part of her already knew the answer. They needed someone who had time to listen. The human's words settled into her soul like accusation and absolution combined. She was queen of 12 worlds, commander of fleets that could shatter stars, ruler of trillions of lives. But when had she last simply held her children without thinking of state business, trade negotiations, or military campaigns? When had she last told them stories instead of lessons about duty and honor? She looked at David Chen, this unremarkable human who cleaned waste recyclers and maintained atmospheric processors, and realized he had given her children something that all her power couldn't provide: the gift of feeling truly safe. The question that burned in her mind wasn't why they had come to him, it was why they felt they couldn't come to her. Captain Vex shifted beside her, awaiting orders. The protocol was clear. Remove the human, discipline the cubs, increase security. But looking at their peaceful faces, Zarathek found herself questioning protocols she had followed without thought for 20 years. Her cubs trusted this human completely. The question was whether she trusted herself to understand why. Standing in the doorway of a janitor's quarters at 0300 hours, Queen Zarathek faced a choice that would define not just her rule, but her role as a mother. Her children slept peacefully in the arms of a stranger who had somehow become their sanctuary, and she found herself wondering if the greatest threat to her family's safety might be the very systems designed to protect them. The alarm had stopped wailing, but the crisis had only begun. David Chen held her children as if they were made of starlight and hope, and Zarathek realized that perhaps they were. The question was whether she still remembered how to see them that way, or if she had forgotten in the weight of crowns and the burden of worlds. In the silence that followed, she made a decision that would ripple through the hegemony like a shockwave. But first, she needed to understand exactly what this human had given her children, and what she had unknowingly taken away. The night was far from over, and Queen Zarathek had questions that demanded answers. But as she watched her youngest son's chest rise and fall in perfect contentment, she found herself hoping that those answers wouldn't destroy the first peace her family had known in years. Some protocols, she realized, might be worth breaking. In the maintenance sector of a starship traveling between worlds, a human janitor held 3 alien children while their mother questioned everything she thought she knew about power, protection, and love. The universe had shifted on its axis, and none of them would ever be the same. The security feeds continued recording, documenting a scene that would soon force the most powerful woman in known space to confront the possibility that her greatest failure as a queen might be her disconnection from her role as a mother. David Chen waited for judgment, knowing his life hung in the balance, while 3 small beings slept in his arms like proof that some things transcended species, rank, and the vast darkness between stars. The future balanced on a knife's edge, and Queen Zarathek held the blade. "Captain," she finally whispered, her voice steady as stone, "we need to talk." But first, she needed to understand what it meant that her children had found home in the arms of a stranger, and whether she had the wisdom to learn from what they had discovered in the darkness of Level 7. The night stretched ahead, full of questions that would reshape everything. But for now, her children slept peacefully, and that was enough to build new worlds upon. Queen Zarathek stepped fully into the small room, and David Chen's fate, along with the future of her family, hung in the balance of what happened next. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper, carrying across the space between them like a prayer or a promise of destruction. "Tell me," she said, settling onto the floor, with fluid grace that spoke of predators and power held in careful check. "Tell me these stories my daughter speaks of. Tell me about homes where families stay together." David's eyes widened, but he didn't move, didn't disturb the sleeping children who trusted him completely. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of worlds and the simplicity of truth. "Your Majesty, On Earth we have a saying, home isn't where you rule, it's where you belong. The words struck her like weapons made of hope and accusation combined. Cyrus stirred at the sound, her small hand reaching up to touch David's face with the casual affection of a child who had never learned to fear the touch of those who care for her. More, Sarathek whispered, and settled in to listen to stories that would change the course of empires. But even as she prepared to hear tales of distant Earth, part of her mind cataloged escape routes, defensive positions, and the 8 different ways Captain Vex could eliminate the human without waking her children. Old habits died hard, even when learning to live again. Some revolutions, she realized, began not with weapons or declarations, but with a mother sitting on a maintenance worker's floor, asking to hear bedtime stories about homes where love mattered more than protocol. The universe held its breath, waiting to see what Queen Zarathek would choose when the stories ended and dawn forced decisions that would echo across the stars. In David's arms, her cubs slept peacefully, unaware that their simple trust had set in motion events that would reshape the very foundations of the hegemony. But perhaps that was what children did best: love without conditions, trust without fear, and find sanctuary in the hearts of those wise enough to value compassion over conquest. The human began to speak, his voice soft as starlight, and Queen Zarathek listened to stories of Earth while her children dreamed of gardens and families that stayed together, no matter how far they traveled from home. Outside the small room, Captain Vex stood guard, knowing that history was being written in whispers, and wondering if his queen would emerge from this night as the same woman who had entered. Some transformations he knew left no survivors, especially those that began with the simple question of why children sought comfort in unexpected places. The maintenance sector hummed around them, machinery steady as heartbeats, while a human janitor told alien children stories of home, and their mother discovered that sometimes the greatest act of sovereignty was learning when to surrender. In the beginning, David whispered, there was a garden where all children were safe, and families that loved each other no matter what stars they came from. Queen Zarathek closed her eyes and let herself remember what it felt like to simply be a mother, if only for one night. Tomorrow would bring consequences and decisions that would reshape worlds. But tonight, in a janitor's quarters deep in the belly of her flagship, she would listen to stories of hope and try to remember what home truly meant. The revolution had begun not with battles or declarations, but with the simple act of 3 children teaching their mother that love transcended protocol, and that sometimes the most important truths were found in the arms of those the universe deemed least significant. Her cubs slept on, peaceful and safe, while their mother learned to dream again of gardens and homes where families stayed together, no matter how dark the spaces between the stars. David's stories continued through the longest night of Queen Zarathek's reign, each word a seed that would grow into changes none of them could imagine. But change had always begun with children who knew no better than to love unconditionally, and parents wise enough to follow where that love led. Even if it led to the maintenance levels of starships, where janitors told better stories than kings, and where the future of civilization rested in the simple trust between a human and 3 alien children who had learned that home wasn't a place at all, but the safety found in arms that held without condition. The night wore on, full of words and wonder, while the universe shifted around them like stars learning new dances. And in the growing light of an artificial dawn, Queen Zarathek would face the most important decision of her reign, whether to punish the love her children had found or learn from it before it was too late. But for now, there were stories to hear and memories to make. In the quiet sanctuary of a maintenance worker's quarters, where 3 children had taught their mother that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't conquest or control, but the simple courage to love without reservation. The stories continued, soft as prayers and strong as starlight, carrying them all toward a dawn that would demand answers to questions none of them had known they needed to ask. "Tell me about the families," Queen Zarathek whispered as her children slept. "Tell me about the ones who stayed together." And David Chen spoke of love that endured across time and distance, while 3 small beings dreamed of gardens they had never seen but somehow knew they belonged in. And their mother learned to see them not as heirs to empire, but as children who deserved to run free under whatever skies called them home. The night stretched on, full of possibility, and the dangerous hope that sometimes the most radical act was simply learning to listen to the wisdom of children who loved without walls and trusted without conditions. Queen Zarathek listened and learned, while the future balanced in the arms of a human janitor who had become the most important person in her children's universe, simply by being present when they needed someone who had time to hear their dreams. Dawn was coming, bringing decisions that would echo through history. But first, there were stories to tell and lessons to learn about what it truly meant to rule, not through fear, but through the courage to love openly and completely. The universe waited, the children slept, and a mother discovered that sometimes the greatest revolutions began not with weapons, but with the simple question of whether she was brave enough to change. Captain Vex remained motionless in the doorway, but his grip on his sidearm relaxed as he watched his queen settle deeper into listening position. She hadn't moved for an hour, hadn't asked for security updates or demanded protocols. She simply sat cross-legged on the metal floor, like any mother might, her attention focused entirely on the human's quiet words and her children's peaceful breathing. David's stories painted pictures of blue skies and green grass, of children who climbed trees and built forts, of parents who came home for dinner instead of sending reports through intermediaries. Each tale was carefully chosen, nothing of war or politics, only the gentle rhythms of lives lived without constant threat. On Earth, David whispered, there's a tradition called bedtime stories. Parents tell them every night, not to teach lessons about duty or honor, but just to help children feel safe enough to dream. Queen Zarathek felt something twist in her chest. The Joker? When had she last helped her children feel safe enough to dream? When had she offered comfort without instruction, presence without agenda? The Royal Nursery's educational programs ran 20 hours a day, filling their minds with languages, mathematics, tactical analysis, diplomatic protocol, but when had they last simply imagined impossible things? Tekli made a small sound in his sleep, his arms tightening around David's waist. The human's hand moved automatically to stroke the child's carapace, the gesture so natural it spoke of weeks of practice. They come to you often, Zarathek observed, her voice barely audible. David nodded carefully, usually around this time. Third shift is quiet, and the other workers are asleep. They slip past the security sensors somehow. They're remarkably clever. Too clever, Zarathek thought. The nursery's biolocks were military-grade, designed to contain beings with natural camouflage and enhanced agility. If her cubs could bypass them regularly, it meant they'd been studying the systems with focused intelligence, planning escapes with the dedication of prisoners. The realization struck her like cold metal. Her children saw their own home as a prison. "What do they tell you?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. David hesitated, glancing down at Syra's sleeping face. They talk about feeling lonely, about wanting to explore the ship, to meet new people, to see how things work. They ask about families on Earth, about children who have friends outside their own species. Each word was carefully measured, delivered without accusation, but heavy with implication. Zara Theko understood. Her children craved connection. She had systematically denied them in the name of security and proper royal bearing. Syra asked me once if human children are required to memorize the genealogy of every noble house in the galaxy before their 5th birth cycle, David continued softly. When I told her most human children spend that time learning to read storybooks and play games, she looked so surprised. Like the concept of childhood being about joy instead of preparation was completely foreign. The knife twisted deeper. Her cubs were being shaped into perfect heirs, trained in every aspect of statescraft and warfare, educated to rule worlds they'd barely seen. But when had they last simply played? Morden builds things, David added, his voice warm with affection. He takes apart maintenance tools and puts them back together in new configurations. He's incredibly gifted. His spatial reasoning is extraordinary. But he told me he's not allowed to touch anything in the royal quarters because it might be important. Zarathek closed her eyes. Her middle child's engineering brilliance was carefully channeled through supervised lessons with approved tutors. The idea of him exploring freely, following curiosity wherever it led, was anathema to palace security. But listening to David's description, she realized they might be limiting not just his freedom, but his potential. And technically, he draws, David whispered, shifting slightly to accommodate the sleeping child's weight. He draws pictures of places he's never seen, forests and oceans and cities where different species live together. He has an incredible imagination, but he apologizes every time he shows me a drawing, like creativity is something shameful. The words hit her like physical blows. Her youngest son, bright and artistic and full of wonder, had been taught to feel shame about the very qualities that made him unique. In shaping him to be a proper prince, she had somehow convinced him that his own nature was inadequate. "They love you very much," David said carefully, watching her face. "They talk about you constantly, about how strong you are, how smart, how you protect the whole galaxy. But sometimes what? Sometimes they wonder if you'd still love them if they weren't royal, if they were just regular children who wanted to play and explore and make friends." The question broke something fundamental inside her. Of course she loved them. They were her children, her heart walking around outside her body. But had she ever actually shown them that love without conditions attached? Had she ever simply held them without mentioning their duties or responsibilities? Looking at them now, curled peacefully in a human's embrace, she realized she couldn't remember the last time they'd sought her comfort instead of her approval. "I need to know," she said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I need to understand what I've done wrong." David met her eyes directly, and she saw no judgment there, only sadness. "Your Majesty, you haven't done anything wrong. You've done exactly what you thought was necessary to prepare them for the responsibilities they'll inherit. But children need more than preparation. They need to feel valued for who they are, not who they'll become." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle hum of atmospheric recyclers and her children's peaceful breathing. Queen Zarathek sat in the maintenance workers' quarters, surrounded by the debris of assumptions she'd never questioned, and tried to remember what her own childhood had been like before duty consumed everything. She remembered gardens, real gardens, not the careful displays in the palace courtyards. She remembered her mother teaching her to identify different flowers, not because it was diplomatically useful, but because beauty had value for its own sake. She remembered playing hide-and-seek with her siblings in the ancient caves beneath the capital, their laughter echoing off stone walls while their parents pretended not to know exactly where they were hiding. When had she stopped believing her children deserved that same joy? "They dream about gardens," she whispered, more to herself than to David. "They dream about freedom," he corrected gently. "Not freedom from you, but freedom to love you, without fear that their affection might be inadequate or improperly expressed." The words settled into her soul like seeds in fertile ground. Her children didn't need less love from her. They needed the freedom to express their own love without constant evaluation and correction. They needed to know that their worth wasn't dependent on their performance as royal heirs. Captain Vex shifted in the doorway, and Zarathek caught his movement in her peripheral vision. He'd been standing guard for hours without complaint, watching his queen learn truths that could reshape the monarchy. Whatever happened next, he would keep these secrets or die with them. She'd chosen her personal guard well. "Your Majesty," David said softly. "Dawn shift begins in 2 hours. They usually wake before then and return to the nursery on their own." An unspoken question hung in the air. What would happen when morning came? Would this night of revelation lead to understanding, or would tradition and protocol reassert themselves once the spell of darkness broke? Zarathek looked at her sleeping children and made a decision that would echo through generations. But first, she needed to hear the rest of David's stories. She needed to understand what world her cubs had built in their imagination, and whether she was wise enough to help them make it real. "Tell me more about these gardens," she said, settling more comfortably on the floor. "Tell me about places where families grow together." David smiled, the expression transforming his tired face into something radiant. And as he began another story about worlds where love grew like wildflowers and children learned joy alongside wisdom, Queen Zarathek felt her own heart opening to possibilities she'd forgotten existed. The night was far from over, and the most important conversations still lay ahead. But for now, she was content to listen and learn, surrounded by her sleeping children and the gentle voice of a man who'd shown them what it meant to feel truly safe. Outside the small room, the ship sailed on through the darkness between stars, carrying them all toward a new dawn, and the choices that would define not just the future of the monarchy, but the meaning of family itself. Some revolutions, Zarathek realized, began with mothers sitting on metal floors, learning to see their children not as heirs to empire, but as beings worthy of love for no reason beyond their existence. The stories continued, soft as whispers and strong as steel, while 3 children slept peacefully, and their mother discovered courage she'd never known she possessed, the courage to change everything she'd believed about power, protection, and the precious gift of simply being present for those who needed her most. Dawn was still hours away, but Queen Zarathik could feel its approach like a promise of transformation. And in the maintenance sector of her flagship, surrounded by humming machines and the scent of industrial cleaners, she prepared to become the mother her children needed her to be, even if it meant dismantling the very foundations of everything she'd built as queen. The universe held its breath, waiting to see what would grow from the seeds of understanding planted in the darkness of Level 7, where a human janitor had kept 3 alien children safe and taught their mother that sometimes the most powerful act of sovereignty was learning to surrender to love. Stories flowed like water in dry places, carrying them all toward a dawn that would demand new definitions of strength, protection, and the courage required to raise children who could love fearlessly in a universe that often demanded fear. But for now, there were tales of gardens and families, whispered in the darkness while the future took shape around them like stars learning to dance in new configurations across the vast sky of possibility. The children slept. The stories continued. And Queen Zarathek prepared to discover whether she was brave enough to build the world her cubs had been dreaming of. One gentle revolution at a time. As Syra stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching up to touch David's face with unconscious trust, Queen Zarathek felt the last of her defenses crumble. This wasn't about protocol or security or royal dignity. This was about 3 children who'd found something they needed, and a mother learning to see them clearly for the first time in too long. The revolution had already begun. Now came the harder task of figuring out how to build something worthy of their dreams. Dawn approached like a reckoning, but for the first time in years, Queen Zarathek faced it without fear. She had work to do, changes to make, and children to love in ways that honored both their royal heritage and their fundamental need to be seen, known, and cherished for exactly who they were. The future stretched ahead, full of possibility and hope, while 3 small beings slept peacefully in the arms of love itself. As the ship sailed on through star-scattered darkness, Queen Zarathek began to plan a garden. When Syra's eyes fluttered open an hour before dawn, she found her mother still sitting cross-legged on the floor, listening with focused attention as David described harvest festivals where entire communities celebrated together regardless of species or status. The child showed no surprise at her mother's presence, only sleepy contentment as she snuggled deeper into the human's embrace. "Mama," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep, "David was telling us about tree houses." "Treehouses?" Zarathek leaned forward, genuinely curious. "Homes built in the branches where children can be close to the sky," Syra explained, her eyes bright despite the early hour. "Where you can see everything but feel safe because the tree protects you." The metaphor wasn't lost on Queen Zarathek. Her children wanted elevation without isolation, perspective without disconnection from the life below. They craved the ability to observe and participate, to be royal without being removed from the experiences that gave meaning to power. Morden stirred next, his engineering mind immediately engaged. "The structural calculations would be fascinating," he murmured, still half asleep. Weight distribution across living support systems that continued growing and changing. Dynamic equilibrium with organic materials. David chuckled softly. On Earth, most children build tree houses with whatever materials they can find. It's not about perfection, it's about creation and adventure. "But the safety protocols," Morden began, then stopped himself, looking embarrassed. "What about them?" his mother asked gently. "Nothing, Mama. It's just children on Earth are allowed to build things that might not work perfectly the first time. They're allowed to try and fail and try again. The admission hung in the air like an indictment. Zarathek realized that her children had been taught to fear failure so thoroughly that they'd stopped attempting anything that couldn't be executed flawlessly on the first try. In protecting them from risk, she'd robbed them of resilience. Tekli was the last to wake, his small arms tightening around David's waist as consciousness returned. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes went immediately to his mother, and she saw a flicker of fear cross his features. "Am I in trouble?" he asked in the smallest voice she'd ever heard. The question broke her heart completely. Her youngest child, creative, gentle, endlessly curious, expected punishment for seeking comfort, for finding joy, for being a child with needs beyond preparation for distant thrones. "No, my darling," she said, and her voice was steady as starlight. "You're not in trouble. None of you are." Tekli's relief was visible, his shoulders relaxing as he settled back against David's chest. "David tells the best stories," he confided. "Stories about places where children draw pictures on walls and nobody minds, because art is supposed to be everywhere." "Everywhere?" Zarathek asked. "Not just in designated cultural appreciation spaces," Syra added with 7-year-old solemnity. "Just everywhere, because beauty makes people happy, and happy people are nicer to each other." The logic was unassailable and completely foreign to palace life, where every artistic element had been carefully curated by committees and approved through multiple levels of cultural advisors. The idea of spontaneous beauty created by children for no reason beyond joy was revolutionary. Captain Vex appeared in the doorway, his movements silent but purposeful. "Your Majesty, dawn shift begins in 30 minutes. The nursery staff will conduct their morning security check soon." The moment of reckoning had arrived. Protocol demanded that her children return to their quarters, that David be removed and questioned, that life resume its carefully ordered patterns. But looking at her cubs, still peaceful and open in ways she hadn't seen in months, Zarathek found herself questioning whether some patterns deserved to be broken. "Captain," she said quietly, "I need you to delay the security check. Tell them the children are with me for early morning lessons." "Yes, Your Majesty." She turned to David, who had remained still throughout her children's awakening, his role clearly understood as sanctuary rather than entertainment. "You've given my children something precious," she said formally. "I need to understand what debt I owe you." David's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, no debt. This has been... These children are extraordinary. Being trusted by them is honor enough. Nevertheless," she continued, "what you've done extends beyond normal duties. What you've provided fills needs I didn't recognize existed. That oversight is on me, not you." She paused, studying her children's faces as they listened to adult conversation that would determine their future. They showed no fear now, only curiosity and the quiet confidence that came from feeling genuinely safe. "David," she said finally, "I'm going to ask something of you that goes far beyond janitorial duties." The human straightened slightly, careful not to disturb the children. "Your Majesty, I want you to help me understand what my children need that they're not getting. I want you to teach me how to give them the freedom to be children while still preparing them for the responsibilities they'll inherit." The silence that followed was profound. Captain Vex stood frozen in the doorway, clearly processing implications that reached far beyond simple childcare. The children looked between their mother and David with growing excitement, sensing possibility in the adult words they only partly understood. "Your Majesty," David said carefully, "that would require significant changes to existing protocols." "Then we change them," she replied with the calm authority that had once reshaped star maps. "I am Queen of 12 worlds, commander of fleets that patrol the galaxy's edge, ruler of trillions of lives. But I am also a mother who just discovered that her children seek comfort from a stranger because they're afraid to seek it from her." Her voice carried pain and determination in equal measure. "If I can reorganize trade routes that span sectors, I can certainly reorganize our family life to include joy alongside duty." Syra sat up straighter, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "Mama, Does this mean we can build tree houses? Queen Zarathek looked at her eldest child, brilliant, responsible, already showing signs of the leadership she'd inherit, and saw not just a future ruler, but a 7-year-old girl who wanted to climb trees and feel close to the sky. "Yes, my darling," she said, and her voice carried the weight of promises that would reshape empires. "We're going to build tree houses and gardens and anything else your hearts desire, as long as we can do it safely and together." Morden bounced slightly in David's lap, his engineering mind already racing. Could we really? Could we build something just for us, without committees and approval boards and safety assessments that take months? "We're going to find out," Zarathek replied. "But first, I need to learn how to be the mother you need me to be, and David is going to help me." She turned to the human again, her expression serious. "I'm offering you a position that doesn't exist yet. Family advisor to the royal household. Your duties would include teaching me about human childhood development, helping design spaces where my children can grow freely, and serving as consultant in matters of family happiness." David's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Your Majesty, I'm not qualified for such responsibilities. I clean waste recyclers and maintain atmospheric systems. And you've given my children more genuine peace in 2 weeks than 12 royal educators have provided in 7 years, she countered. "Qualifications are relative. Results matter more." Techley looked up at David with absolute faith. "Please stay," he whispered. "Please help us build gardens where families can grow together." The human's resistance crumbled visibly. "If your Majesty believes I can serve your family effectively, I believe," Zarathek said firmly, "that my children are excellent judges of character, and they've chosen you completely. That's qualification enough." Captain Vex stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the implications for palace security protocols will be addressed through careful planning and reasonable accommodation," she finished. "Vex, I'm not abandoning royal responsibilities or compromising family safety. I'm expanding our definition of what safety actually means." She gestured to her children, still clustered around David with obvious contentment. "True security isn't just physical protection. It's raising children who are strong enough, flexible enough, and confident enough to handle whatever challenges they face. Children who know they're loved unconditionally, who understand joy as well as duty." The words felt revolutionary even as she spoke them, but they rang with truth that resonated in her bones. Her cubs needed more than preparation for distant thrones. They needed childhoods worth remembering, relationships that would sustain them through future hardships, and the knowledge that they were valued for who they were, not just what they would become. "David," she said, turning back to the human who had unknowingly changed everything, "your first assignment is helping me design a garden, a real garden, where children can plant things and watch them grow, where families can work together and be together without protocol or agenda." "And tree houses?" Syra asked hopefully. "And tree houses," Zarathek confirmed. "And art studios where Techley can draw on walls, and engineering workshops where Morden can build things that might not work perfectly the first time." Her children's faces lit up like small stars, their joy so brilliant it took her breath away. This was how they were supposed to look, excited about possibilities, confident in love, eager to explore and create and grow. "When do we start?" Morden asked, practically vibrating with anticipation. Queen Zarathek stood, her movements fluid and decisive. "We start now. Captain Vex, please inform the nursery staff that the children will be with me for the day. Cancel all scheduled lessons and appointments. Your Majesty, you have a diplomatic meeting with the Centauri delegation at—" "Reschedule it," she said firmly. "Today I'm learning to be a mother. Everything else can wait." She looked around the small maintenance quarters that had become the catalyst for transformation, then back to David, who still held her children like they were precious beyond measure. "Come," she said, extending one of her 6 hands toward Techley. "Let's go find a place to plant our garden." Her youngest son scrambled from David's lap into her arms, his small form fitting against her chest like he belonged there, which she realized with crystal clarity he always had. Syra and Morden followed, moving toward her with eager trust that made her throat tight with emotion. As they left the maintenance sector together, Queen and children, and a human janitor who'd just been promoted to family advisor, Captain Vex fell into protective formation around them. But there was something different in his posture, a looseness that spoke of guards protecting not just royal persons, but a family, learning to be whole. "Where shall we build our garden?" StoryHFY asked as they walked through corridors that suddenly seemed less like sterile passages and more like paths toward possibility. "Somewhere we can see the stars," Cyrus said immediately. "Somewhere with good soil composition for diverse plant varieties," Morden added. "Somewhere beautiful," Techley concluded with simple certainty. Queen StoryHFY smiled, feeling muscles in her face that hadn't moved in genuine joy for longer than she cared to remember. "Then we'll build it somewhere we can see the stars, with perfect soil for growing anything we want. And we'll make it so beautiful that everyone who sees it will remember why gardens exist." David walked beside them, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Your Majesty, are you certain about this? The changes you're proposing will shake the foundations of everything I've built as queen," she finished. "Good. Some foundations need shaking. Some revolutions begin with children who have the courage to seek what they need, and parents who have the wisdom to follow where love leads." They continued through the ship toward whatever spaces could be transformed into something worth growing in, while light from distant stars streamed through observation windows and painted everything in shades of hope and possibility. Behind them, the empty maintenance quarters bore witness to the night that had changed everything. A simple room where 3 children had found sanctuary, and their mother had learned that the most powerful act of sovereignty was sometimes the courage to surrender to love. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise, and challenges in equal measure, but for the first time in years, Queen StoryHFY faced it not just as a ruler, but as a mother whose children trusted her completely, and a woman who'd remembered that joy wasn't weakness, but the foundation upon which all lasting strength was built. They would build gardens and tree houses, create art and explore freely, make mistakes and learn from them together. They would remain royal, but they would also be human in all the ways that mattered most. And in the maintenance sector of a starship sailing between worlds, the silence settled like peace itself, holding the memory of revolution that had begun with whispered stories and ended with a family learning to grow together toward whatever light they could find in the vast darkness of space. Some changes echoed across galaxies. Some began with children wise enough to seek love and parents brave enough to follow. The revolution was complete. The garden was just beginning. As they reached the observation deck that would become their garden, dawn broke across the ship's viewports, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. Queen StoryHFY held her youngest son, while her other children pressed close, all of them looking out at the stars, that seemed suddenly less distant and more like destinations waiting to be explored together. "Come on," she said, her voice rich with anticipation and love. "Let's go plant something beautiful." And together, they stepped forward into whatever grew next, carrying seeds of change that would bloom across the universe, like hope itself taking root in the fertile ground of second chances and family love that had learned to flourish without limits. The stars watched them plan their garden, and the future held its breath to see what would grow.